Hey all. Um, so, apologies for last week. Uh, sorry to miss one of these on short notice, but life happens. Um, Thank you for joining me again for what I think will probably be the last session from Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. I have the feeling that we have probably run most of the story out to its conclusions, but there's always room for dessert and or denouement. So when we're through with this, I think I need to talk a little bit about my overall impressions. But let's get through to the end first. See if those overall impressions are still the same as they are right now. So, all right. Big Sleep, chapter 31. The butler appeared with my hat. I put it on and said, "What do you think of him?" "He's not as weak as he looks, sir." "If he was, he'd be ready for burial. What did this Regan fellow have that bored into him so?" The butler looked at me levelly, and yet with a queer lack of expression. "Youth, sir," he said, "and the soldier's eye." "Like yours," I said. "If I may say so, sir, not unlike yours." "Thanks. How were the ladies this morning?" He shrugged politely. "Just what I thought," I said, and he opened the door for me. I stood outside on the step and looked down the vistas of grassed terraces and trimmed trees and flower beds to the tall metal railing at the bottom of the gardens. I saw Carmen about halfway down, sitting on a stone bench with her head between her hands, looking forlorn and alone. I went down the red brick steps that led from terrace to terrace. I was quite close before she heard me. She jumped up and whirled like a cat. She wore the light blue slacks she had worn the first time I saw her. Her blonde hair was the same loose, tawny wave. Her face was white. Red spots flared in her cheeks as she looked at me. Her eyes were slaty. "Bored," I said. She smiled slowly, rather shyly, then nodded quickly. And then she whispered, "You're not mad at me." "I thought you were mad at me." She put her thumb up and giggled. "I'm not." When she giggled, I didn't like her anymore. I looked around. A target hung on a tree about 30 feet away with some darts sticking to it. There were 3 or 4 more on the stone bench where she'd been sitting. "For people with money, you and your sister don't seem to have much fun." She looked at me under her long lashes. This was the look that was supposed to make me roll over on my back. I said, "You like throwing those darts?" "Uh-huh. That reminds me of something." I looked back toward the house. By moving about 3 feet, I made a tree hide me from it. I took her little pearl-handled gun out of my pocket. "I brought you back your artillery. I cleaned it, loaded it up. Take my tip. Don't shoot it at people unless you get to be a better shot. Remember?" Her face went paler, and her thin thumb dropped. She looked at me, then at the gun I was holding. There was a fascination in her eyes. "Yes," she said, and nodded. And then, suddenly, "Teach me to shoot." "Huh? Teach me to shoot? I'd like that. Here. It's against the law." She came close to me and took the gun out of my hand, cuddled her hand around the butt. Then she tucked it quickly inside her slacks, almost with a furtive movement, and looked around. I know where, she said in a secret voice. Down by some of the old wells. She pointed off down the hill. Teach me? I looked into her slaty blue eyes. I might as well have looked at a couple of bottle tops. All right. Give me back the gun until I see if the place looks all right. She smiled and made a mouth, then handed it back with a secret, naughty air as if she was giving me a key to her room. We walked up the steps and around to my car. The gardens seemed deserted. The sunshine was as empty as a headwaiter's smile. We got into the car, and I drove down the sunken driveway and out through the gates. Where's Vivian? I asked. Not up yet, she giggled. I drove on, down the hill, through the quiet, opulent streets with their faces washed by the rain, bore east to La Brea, then south. We reached the place she meant in about 10 minutes. In there. She leaned out of the window and pointed. It was a narrow dirt road, not much more than a track, like the entrance to some foothill ranch. The wide, 5-barred gate was folded back against the stump and looked as if it hadn't been shut in years. The road was fringed with tall eucalyptus trees and deeply rutted. Trucks had used it. It was empty and sunny now, but not yet dusty. The rain had been too hard and too recent. I followed the ruts along, and the noise of city traffic grew curiously and quickly faint, as if this were not in the city at all, but far away in a daydream land. Then the oil-stained, motionless walking beam of a squat wooden derrick stuck up over a branch. I could see the rusty old steel cable that connected this walking beam with a half a dozen others. The beams didn't move. Probably hadn't moved for a year. The wells were no longer pumping. There was a pile of rusted pipe, a loading platform that sagged at one end, half a dozen empty oil drums lying in a ragged pile. There was the stagnant, oil-scummed water of an old sump, iridescent in the sunlight. Are they going to make a park of all this? I asked. She dipped her chin down and gleamed at me. It's about time. The smell of that sump would poison a herd of goats. This the place you had in mind? Uh-huh. Like it? It's beautiful. I pulled up beside the loading platform. We got out. I listened. The hum of the traffic was a distant web of sound, like the buzzing of bees. The place was as lonely as a churchyard. Even after the rain, the tall eucalyptus trees still looked dusty. They always looked dusty. A branch broken off by the wind had fallen over the edge of the sump, and the flat, leathery leaves dangled in the water. I walked around the sump and looked into the pump house. There was some junk in it, nothing that looked like recent activity. Outside, a big wooden bull wheel was tilted against the wall. It looked like a good place, all right. I went back to the car. The girl stood beside it, preening her hair and holding it out in the sun. Gimme, she said, and held her hand out. I took the gun out and put it in her palm. I bent down and picked up a rusty can. Take it easy now, I said. It's loaded in all 5. I'll go over and set this can in that square opening in the middle of that big wooden wheel. See? I pointed, and she ducked her head, delighted. It's about 30 feet. Don't start shooting until I get back beside you, okay? Okay, she giggled. I went back around the sump and set the can up in the middle of the bull wheel. Made a swell target. If she missed the can, which she was certain to do, she would probably hit the wheel. That would stop a small slug completely. However, she wasn't even going to hit that. I went back towards her around the sump. When I was about 10 feet from her at the edge of the sump, she showed me all her sharp little teeth and brought the gun up and started to hiss. I stopped dead, the sump water stagnant and stinking at my back. Stand there, you son of a bitch, she said. The gun pointed at my chest. Her hand seemed to be quite steady. The hissing sound grew louder, and her face had the scraped bone look. Aged, deteriorated, become animal. Not a nice animal. I laughed at that. I started to walk towards her. I saw her small finger tighten on the trigger and grow white at the tip. I was about 6 feet away from her when she started to shoot. The sound of the gun made a sharp slap without body, a brittle crack in the sunlight. I didn't see any smoke. I stopped again and grinned at her. She fired twice more very quickly. I don't think any of the shots would have missed. There were 5 in the little gun. She had fired 4. I rushed her. I didn't want the last one in my face, so I swerved to one side. She gave it to me quite carefully, not worried at all. I think I felt the hot breath of the powder blast a little. I straightened up. "My, but you're cute," I said. Her hand holding the empty gun began to shake violently. The gun fell out of it. Her mouth began to shake. Her whole face went to pieces. Then her head screwed up toward her left ear and froth showed on her lips. Her breath made a whining sound. She swayed. I caught her as she fell. She was already unconscious. I pried her teeth open with both hands and stuffed a wadded handkerchief in between them. It took all my strength to do it. I lifted her up and got her into the car, then went back for the gun and dropped it into my pocket. I climbed in under the wheel, backed the car, and drove back the way we had come along the rutted road, out of the gateway, back up the hill, and so home. Carmen lay crumpled in the corner of the car, without motion. I was halfway up the drive to the house before she stirred. Then her eyes suddenly opened wide and wild. She sat up. "What happened?" she gasped. "Nothing. Why?" "Oh, yes, it did," she giggled. "I wet myself." "They always do," I said. She looked at me with a sudden, sick speculation and began to moan. End of chapter. Chapter 32. The gentle-eyed, horse-faced maid led me in the long gray and white upstairs sitting room, with the ivory drapes tumbled extravagantly on the floor and the white carpet from wall to wall. A screen star's boudoir, a place of charm and seduction, artificial as a wooden leg. It was empty at the moment. The door closed behind me with the unnatural softness of a hospital door. A breakfast table on wheels stood by the chaise lounge. Its silver glittered. There were cigarette ashes in the coffee cup. I sat down and waited. It seemed a long time before the door opened again and Vivian came in. She was in oyster-white lounging pajamas, trimmed with white fur, cut as flowingly as a summer sea frothing on the beach of some small and exclusive island. She went past me in long, smooth strides and sat down on the edge of the chaise lounge. There was a cigarette in her lips, at the corner of her mouth. Her nails today were copper red from quick to tip, without half-moons. "So you're just a brute after all," she said quietly, staring at me. "An utter, callous brute. You killed a man last night. Never mind how I heard it. I heard it. And now you have to come out here and frighten my kid sister into a fit." I didn't say a word. She began to fidget. She moved over to a slipper chair and put her head back against a white cushion that lay along the back of the chair against the wall. She blew pale gray smoke upwards and watched it float toward the ceiling and come apart in wisps that were for a little while distinguishable from the air and then melted and were nothing. And then very slowly she lowered her eyes and gave me a cool, hard glance. "I don't understand you," she said. "I'm thankful as hell one of us kept his head the night before last. It's bad enough to have a bootlegger in my past. Why don't you, for Christ's sake, say something?" "How is she?" "Oh, she's all right, I suppose. Fast asleep. She always goes to sleep. What did you do to her? Not a thing. I came out of the house after seeing your father, and she was out in front. She'd been throwing darts at a target on a tree. I went down to speak to her because I had something that belonged to her. A little revolver Owen Taylor gave her once. She took it over to Brody's place the other evening, the evening he was killed. I had to take it away from her there. I didn't mention it, so perhaps you didn't know it. The black sternwood eyes got large and empty. It was her turn not to say anything. She was pleased to get her little gun back, and she wanted me to teach her how to shoot, and she wanted to show me the old oil wells down the hill where your family made some of its money. So we went down there, and the place was pretty creepy, all rusted metal and old wood, silent wells and greasy, scummy sumps. Maybe that upset her. I guess you've been there yourself. Kind of eerie. Yes, it is. It was a small, breathless voice now. So we went in there, and I stuck a can up in a bull wheel for her to pop at, and she threw a wingding. It looked like a mild epileptic fit to me. Yes. The same minute voice. She has them once in a while. Is that all you wanted to see me about? I guess you still wouldn't tell me what Eddie Mars has on you. Nothing at all. And I'm getting a little tired of that question, she said coldly. Do you know a man named Camino? She drew her fine black brows together in thought. Vaguely. I seem to remember the name. Eddie Mars's triggerman. Tough hombre, they said. I guess he was. Without a little help from a lady, I'd be where he is, in the morgue. The ladies seemed to... She stopped dead and whitened. I can't joke about it, she said simply. I'm not joking. If I seem to talk in circles, it just seems that way. It all ties together. Everything. Giger and his cute little blackmail tricks, Brody and his pictures, Eddie Mars and his roulette tables, Camino and the girl Rusty Regan didn't run away with. It all ties together. I'm afraid I don't even know what you're talking about. Suppose you did. It would be something like this. Giger got his hooks into your sister, which isn't very difficult. Got some notes from her and tried to blackmail your father with them, in a nice way. Eddie Mars was behind Giger, protecting him and using him for a cat's paw. Your father sent for me instead of paying up, which showed that he wasn't scared about anything. Eddie Mars wanted to know that. He had something on you, and he wanted to know if he had it on the general, too. If he had, he could collect a lot of money in a hurry. If not, he would have to wait until you got your share of the family fortune, and in the meantime be satisfied with whatever spare cash he could take away from you across the roulette table. Giger was killed by Owen Taylor, who was in love with your silly little sister and didn't like the kind of games Giger played with her. That didn't mean anything to Eddie. He was playing a deeper game than Giger knew anything about, or than Brody knew anything about, or anybody except you and Eddie and a tough guy named Canino. Your husband disappeared, and Eddie, knowing everybody knew there had been bad blood between him and Regan, hid his wife out at Rialito and put Canino to guard her so that it would look as if she'd run away with Regan. He even got Regan's car into the garage of the place where Mona Mars had been living. But that sounds a little silly, taken merely as an attempt to divert suspicion that Eddie had killed your husband or had him killed. It isn't so silly, really. He had another motive. He was playing for $1 million or so. He knew where Regan had gone and why, and he didn't want the police to have to find out. He wanted them to have an explanation of the disappearance that would keep them satisfied. Am I boring you? You tire me, she said in a dead, exhausted voice. God, how you tire me. I'm sorry. I'm not just fooling around trying to be clever. Your father offered me $1,000 this morning to find Regan. That's a lot of money to me, but I can't do it. Her mouth jumped open. Her breath was suddenly strained and harsh. Give me a cigarette, she said thickly. Why? The pulse in her throat had begun to throb. I gave her a cigarette and lit a match and held it for her. She drew in a lungful of smoke and let it out raggedly, and then the cigarette seemed to be forgotten between her fingers. She never drew on it again. Well, the Missing Persons Bureau can't find him, I said. It's not so easy. What they can't do, it's not likely that I can do. Oh, there was a shade of relief in her voice. That's one reason. The missing persons people think he just disappeared on purpose, pulled down the curtain, as they call it. They don't think Eddie Mars did away with him. Who said anybody did away with him? We're coming to it. For a brief instant, her face seemed to come to pieces, to become merely a set of features without form or control. Her mouth looked like the prelude to a scream, but only for an instant. The Sternwood blood had to be good for something more than her black eyes and her recklessness. I stood up and took the smoking cigarette from between her fingers and killed it in an ashtray. Then I took Carmen's little gun out of my pocket and laid it carefully, with exaggerated care, on her white satin knee. I balanced it there. It stepped back with my head on one side like a window dresser, getting the effect of a new twist of a scarf around a dummy's neck. I sat down again. She didn't move. Her eyes came down millimeter by millimeter and looked at the gun. It's harmless, I said. All 5 chambers empty. She fired them all. She fired them all at me. The pulse jumped wildly in her throat. Her voice tried to say something and couldn't. She swallowed. From a distance of 5 or 6 feet, I said. Cute little thing, isn't she? Too bad I'd loaded the gun with blanks. I grinned nastily. I had a hunch about what she would do if she got the chance. She brought her voice back from a long way off. You're a horrible man, she said. Horrible. Yeah. You're her big sister. What are you going to do about it? You can't prove a word of it. Can't prove what? That she fired at you. You said you were down there around the wells with her alone. You can't prove a word of what you say. Oh, that? I wasn't thinking of trying. I was thinking of another time, when the shells in the little gun had bullets in them. Her eyes were pools of darkness, much emptier than darkness. I was thinking of the day Regan disappeared. Late in the afternoon, when he took her down to those old wells to teach her to shoot, put a can somewhere, told her to pop at it, stood near her while she shot. And she didn't shoot at the can. She turned the gun and shot him, just the way she tried to shoot me today. And for the same reason. She moved a little. The gun slid off her knee and fell to the floor. It was one of the loudest sounds I ever heard. Her eyes were riveted on my face. Her voice was a stretched whisper of agony. Carmen. Merciful God. Carmen. Why? Do I really have to tell you why she shot at me? Yes. Her eyes were still terrible. I'm afraid you do. Night before last, when I got home, she was in my apartment. She had kidded the manager into letting her in to wait for me. She was in my bed, naked. I threw her out on her ear. I guess maybe Regan did the same thing to her sometime. But you can't do that to Carmen. She drew her lips back and made a half-hearted attempt to lick them. It made her for a brief instant look like a frightened child. The lines of her cheeks sharpened, and her hand went up slowly like an artificial hand worked by wires, and its fingers closed slowly and stiffly around the white fur at her collar. They drew the fur tight against her throat. After that, she just sat staring. Money, she croaked. I suppose you want money. How much money? I tried not to sneer. $15,000? I nodded. That would be about right. That would be the established fee. That was what he had in his pockets when she shot him. That would be what Mr. Canino got for disposing of the body when you went to Eddie Mars for help. But that would be small change to what Eddie expects to collect one of these days, wouldn't it? You son of a bitch. Uh-huh. I'm a very smart guy. I haven't a feeling or a scruple in the world. All I have is the itch for money. I am so money greedy that for $25 a day and expenses, mostly gasoline and whiskey, I do my thinking myself, what there is of it. I risk my whole future. Hatred of the cops and of Eddie Mars and his pals. I dodge bullets and eat saps and say thank you very much. If you have any more trouble, I hope you'll think of me. I'll just leave one of my cards in case anything comes up. I do all this for $25 a day, and maybe just a little to protect what little pride a broken and sick old man has left in his blood, in the thought that his blood is not poison, and that although his two little girls are a trifle wild, as many nice girls are these days, they're not perverts or killers, and that makes me a son of a bitch. All right. I don't care anything about that. I've been called that by people of all sizes and shapes, including your little sister. She called me worse than that for not getting into bed with her. I got $500 from your father, which I didn't ask for, but he can afford to give it to me. I can get another 1,000 for finding Mr. Rusty Regan, if I could find him. Now you offer me 15 grand. That makes me a big shot. With 15 grand, I could own a home and a new car and 4 suits of clothes. Might even take a vacation without worrying about losing a case. That's fine. What are you offering it to me for? Can I go on being a son of a bitch, or do I have to become a gentleman like that lush that passed out in his car the other night? She was as silent as a stone woman. All right, and went on heavily. Will you take her away? Somewhere far off from here where they can handle her type? Where they'll keep guns and knives and fancy drinks away from her? Well, she might even get herself cured, you know. It's been done. She got up and walked slowly to the windows. The drapes lay in heavy ivory folds beside her feet. She stood among the folds and looked out towards the quiet, darkish foothills. She stood motionless, almost blending into the drapes. Her hands hung loose at her sides, utterly motionless hands. She turned and came back along the room and walked past me blindly. When she was behind me, she caught her breath sharply and spoke. He's in the sump, she said. Horrible, decayed thing. I did it. I did just what you said. I went to Eddie Mars. She came home and told me about it just like a child. She's not normal. I knew the police would get it all out of her. In a little while, she would even brag about it. And if Dad knew, he would call them instantly and tell them the whole story. And sometime in that night, he would die. Not his dying. It's what he would be thinking just before he died. Rusty wasn't a bad fellow. I didn't love him. He was all right, I guess. He just didn't mean anything to me one way or another, alive or dead compared with keeping it from Dad. So you let her run around loose, getting into other jams. I was playing for time, just for time. I played the wrong way, of course. I thought she might even forget it herself. I've heard they do forget what happens in those fits. Maybe she has forgotten it. I knew Eddie Mars would bleed me white, but I didn't care. I had to have help. I could only get it from somebody like him. There have been times when I hardly believed it all myself, and other times when I had to get drunk quickly, whatever time of day it was. Awfully damn quickly. You'll take her away, I said. and do that awfully damn quickly. She still had her back to me. She said softly now, "What about you?" "Nothing about me. I'm leaving. I'll give you 3 days. If you're gone by then, okay. If you're not, out it comes. And don't think I don't mean that." She turned suddenly. "I don't know what to say to you. I don't know how to begin." "Yeah. Get her out of here and see that she's watched every minute." "Promise?" "I promise." "Eddie, forget Eddie. I'll go see him after I get some rest. I'll handle Eddie. He'll try to kill you." "Yeah. His best boy couldn't. I'll take a chance on the others. Does Norris know?" "He'll never tell." "I thought he knew." I went quickly away from her, down the room and out and down the tiled staircase to the front hall. I didn't see anybody when I left. I found my hat alone this time. Outside, the bright gardens had a haunted look, as though small wild eyes were watching me from behind the bushes, as though the sunshine itself had a mysterious something in its light. I got into my car and drove off down the hill. What did it matter where you lay once you were dead? In a dirty sump or in a marble tower on top of a high hill? You were dead. You were sleeping the big sleep. You were not bothered by things like that. Oil and water were the same as wind and air to you. You just slept the big sleep, not caring about the nastiness of how you died or where you fell. Me, I was part of the nastiness now, far more a part of it than Rusty Regan was, but the old man didn't have to be. He could lie quiet in his canopied bed with his bloodless hands folded on the sheet, waiting. His heart was a brief, uncertain murmur. His thoughts were as gray as ashes, and in a little while he too, like Rusty Regan, would be sleeping the big sleep. On the way downtown, I stopped at a bar and had a couple of double scotches. They didn't do me any good. All they did was make me think of Silverwig, and I never saw her again. End of chapter. And in fact, I believe that is the end of our story. So just for fun, why don't I take another crack at that last paragraph, just to give it the drama it deserves. On the way downtown, I stopped at a bar and had a couple of double scotches. They didn't do me any good. All they did was make me think of Silverwig, and I never saw her again. So, that is Raymond Chandler's classic, The Big Sleep. Published in 1939. Let's talk about this for a minute. I am obliged to acknowledge that Chandler had a gift for prose. His words flow beautifully. His ability to create atmosphere is justifiably held up as one of his admirable traits. But can we talk about all the other things? Um, you can argue whether or not the story contains any strong female characters. Um, I would say that any female characters who come across as strong, that is mostly the reader's projection. I don't think it was intended. Um, I think that the intent was to show them as flawed, and maybe the idea was to show that this was a flawed world, that everybody in it was tarnished, uh, and yet the protagonist of the story somehow manages to keep the moral high ground. I don't think I'm into it, if I'm strictly honest. Um, you know, and then there is the matter of the rampant homophobia. Um, as a queer guy, let's be clear about that. I can't help taking that a little personally. All of the slights of regarding perverts and degenerates and so forth, not cool. Not cool. There is some casual anti-Semitism that comes out here and there. Not really into that. There's even a couple of lines that I skipped over that didn't make their way into this, that didn't really make their way into this. Actually, oh, hey, there is a comment. Amy, Nightmare Town, if I recall correctly, was Dashiell Hammett. If I'm thinking of the right story, and yeah, I don't think either one of them really believed in human goodness per se. I think you make an excellent point. I'm not arguing whether the author has a right to be a cynic. I'm just saying I'm not into it. It is not what I choose to bask in for my own entertainment. I will say that I do kind of like Dashiell Hammett, and one of there's a lot of differences between them. My understanding is that Chandler was an oil company executive prior to getting ousted from that job and turning to writing, whereas Hammett was in the military. He was a Pinkerton man. He served in both world wars, and that meant he had done some pretty rotten things. I mean, he was a Pinkerton man during the era when Pinkertons were busting up unions left and right by some really vicious means. Yeah, I don't mean to imply that he is a. I don't mean to imply that Dashiell Hammett is a better person, but he is definitely a blue collar person, however you slice it. And I like the fact that Hammett's prose reads like a report. There's something unvarnished, and actually, there's a quote from one of his Continental Op stories in which he writes in his first person protagonist voice, I don't like eloquence. If it isn't effective enough to pierce your hide, then it's tiresome. And if it is effective enough, then it muddles your thoughts. And that always struck me as the author's own maxim coming through. Um, oh, and another side. Um, my mom recommended that I read Nightwood when I was a kid, but I've never yet got around to it. I will take that under consideration, but maybe not do that as a cold read. In fact, book report aside, well, just to conclude my thoughts, the 30s had some cool things going on. The 30s and 40s, their cars looked cool. They had nice hats. There was a lot of culture that was in the process of being born in the early 20th century. But there was a lot that was disappointing and even outright horrific. And I'm not going to go down the lengthy list of those things, but a lot. There's really a lot of really bad stuff happening around that time. So another era in which bad things happened a lot would be the early 19th century. Here's my segue. Starting next Sunday, I am going to begin another cold reading, this time from Charles Dickens' Bleak House. And I'm given to understand, so it is from a quote from Bleak House that the name of this channel and the name of my family's little camping group emerges, which is the Growlery. And so it's been a little hypocritical for me to use that all these years without having actually read Bleak House. So I'm going to remedy that. But yeah, that'll be fun. That starts next week. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and sign off early for this one because it is super, super hot in this room that I'm in. And thank you all for hanging out with me for this. It's been fun, and I think I will continue it. And yeah, so that's it. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Be well.